even for those who are not fans of cinema, the life story of Clara Bow is truly inspirational. Clara Bow was an American actress who had the height of her career during the silent film era. She was born in New York in July 1905 in a tenement, which was a very, very poor district in the city of New York, whose life conditions can be compared with those of slums nowadays. She was the only kid, and her mother had some sort of mental instability that ran in her family, and her maternal grandmother had already passed away due to this problem. Her aunts, the sisters of her mother, also had the same problem. And her father, Robert, he was a kind of man who had some sort of odd jobs, and he was often away from home, and he didn't treat his wife and daughter well, and he frequently beat his mother and his daughter and his wife, and she had a very poor childhood without the love of her parents, and she had very few friends in her neighborhood. But she loved to go to the cinema, she loved films, and she has watched that often since childhood. Because, of course, even in the beginning of the 20th century, New York was already a very big city, a city full of cultural opportunities. And even though she was very poor, she had lots of access to culture due to the place where she lived. And when she was in her teens, she loved the cinema so much that she was decided to become a cinema actress. And then she tried to go to cinema studios and tried to do whatever she could to become an actress. And then she had an opportunity. There was a beauty contest, and the prize of this beauty contest was a small role in a film. She participated in this beauty contest, and to her surprise, she won that beauty contest. And after a while, she had her first role, a very small role in a film. But then nothing happened. It was just a role, and she didn't have a continuity in her career. As she was still determined to become an actress, she went into many studios in the hopes to become an actress. And then suddenly she was received in one of those studios. She took a test, and then the studio employees found out that Clara had lots of talent with the camera. She could cry on command. She was very expressive, very intense, very emotional, even though she didn't have much formal education, and even though she never attended not even one acting class in her entire life. She was approved in this test, and then she had another role in a film. And then after a while, she was in other studios until a producer called B.P. Schulberg, he acknowledged her talent, and he worked with her. This producer, B.P. Schulberg, would, after some years, work in Paramount. But at the time, the beginning of the 1920s, he worked for a small studio, and Clara worked there for some years. And after a while, her films became successful, her talent became acknowledged by more people, and then she started making lots of films. Actually, Clara acted in too many films, because since the beginning of her career, there was a kind of trend that would take place until almost the end of her career, that she was extremely overworked. Why? She was overworked by the studio and the producers because her films were successful, because she was very charismatic, she had lots of fans, and her films and merely her presence in films were important to have lots of box office hits. And then she started working, making films with lots of competence. But then this producer, B.P. Schulberg, started working in a major Hollywood studio called Paramount. And it was in Paramount, in the end of the 1920s, that Clara's fame was clear worldwide. She starred in some films that are known among silent film fans until nowadays. Especially one film that must be talked about is the film It, which was made in the United States in 1927. Clara was the girl who had it, which would be a word for sex appeal. And this film was based in a book by a female author called Eleanor Green, who was still alive at the time, and she met Clara, and they two became friends. And Clara, this film It was a major hit. It was a nice thing, but at the same time, Clara became known as a kind of promiscuous woman, the sex machine, the extremely sensual woman. And of course, she was sensual, she had sex appeal, yes. But it also gave room to lots of gossip about Clara, gossip that she didn't deserve, claiming that she was so promiscuous that she had sex with an entire football team. She was so promiscuous that she had sex even with animals. She was so promiscuous that she was involved in orgies. But why such famous actress like Clara Bow was also victim of so many horrible gossips? We must remember that Clara was originally a very, very poor girl. She was kind of coarse, and she wasn't taken seriously at the studio because she wasn't so sophisticated, because of her coarse manners, and she was treated as if she were stupid, kind of like that. And she was overworked in the beginning of her career when she worked for B.P. Schulberg. And when she went to Paramount, she was still overworked, she was still exploited. Her salary was much, much lower than the salary of other Hollywood stars of the era. And then things took a proportion that, first of all, Paramount didn't mind to give Clara good films for her because she was so popular, she was so successful that her fans would watch any film that she participated. So, if merely her presence was enough to make people watch the films, why bothering giving her good films? And after all, she was such a good actress with so much natural talent that she would have an excellent performance no matter how bad the film was. But the point is that for years, Clara worked a lot. For years, she was mobbed by journalists. For years, there was lots of stress, lots of gossip. Remember, she had a kind of mental disease that ran in her family, that her grandmother had, her mother had, her aunts had. Let's keep this in mind. In addition to all those gossip and problems, despite all these problems, By everyone who was around her, said that Clara had a very easygoing, friendly temperament. She didn't have the so-called star temperament. She was a very generous people who helped other actresses, who didn't fear competition. She was friend of everyone, and she was very chatty, very nice, very lively, a very good girl, despite all pressures. She was a good person. Perhaps not as, polite as people could imagine, but she had a very, very difficult life. Not only because of poverty, but because of mental disease, lack of love, lack of a good upbringing, lack of formal education. Still, she was immensely talented and was a very, very, very good person with a good heart. And she had some affairs with famous Hollywood people like Victor Fleming, Gilbert Holland, Arthur Jacobson, Gary Cooper, and she had some relationships during this period, but she would eventually marry in the beginning of the 1930s an actor called Rex Bell, which was his nickname on screen. His actual name was George Belden, and he turned out to be a very nice man. He was a good husband for her. And before her marriage, there was another source of pressure for Clara, which was the advent of talkies. Because when there was this turn of silent films to talkie films, this represented the end of the careers of many actors. Clara did have a good voice for films. She could speak well, she could sing well, but in the end of the 1920s, she was overworked, she was stressed, and she was very, very frightened about the new media of talkies. To make things worse, the talkies, at least in the first years, they didn't give much room to actors to move in the studio and to have the acting, the spontaneous and improvised acting that they were used to have. Because at first, the first years of the talk era, it was necessary to have huge microphones in the studio. The kind of cameras changed. The top priority while making a film was catching the sounds properly. The machines and cameras, they were supposed to record the sound of actors speaking because the audience was very interested to listen to the lines of actors, to listen to the voice of actors. So all of a sudden, in the beginning, the first years of the talk era, the acting of actors had to be restrained, not too many movements, and the studios had to be very, very silent because otherwise there would be other noises as interference. So it was very, very bad news to an actress like Clara, who was so lively, who was so full of energy, who made movements, who was expressive, and all of a sudden she had to be restrained, self-controlled. It wasn't her kind of acting. To make things worse, Paramount has never helped her in any regard. And it wasn't different with the advent of talkies. And they simply didn't help her, for example, with speech lessons, giving her time to prepare. And her first film, her first talkie film, was made in only 2 weeks. She only had 2 weeks to adjust, to change all her acting, all her working methods, all her style. and to overcome her fear of microphones. And she did well. The result was good. But back then, she was exhausted. She no longer had self-confidence in her own abilities. And she didn't really like to make the talkie films. She didn't really like to have a microphone close to her all the time. However, she was still under contract with Paramount and she had to do some films. But it was another source of stress for her. Around the same time, she had to face a very emotionally demanding lawsuit against her former personal secretary, and it was another scandal in the media, and all those things took a toll on Clara. Then she married her husband. She was with him in a ranch for a while to get some rest, to get some rid of the stress, and she would eventually return and make 2 other films. In 1932, Call Her Savage, and in 1933, Hoopla. They were good films. She did well, as always, but then she no longer wanted to have a career as an actress. She wanted to rest. She became a mother on the following year, in 1934, and things seemed to have a happy ending for Clara in her life, but not yet. She had her first son in 1934. Her second son would be born in 1938. At the time, she had a happy marriage, but with some problems because sometimes her husband had to be away in her professional activities. She didn't like that, and she wasn't satisfied. But we must understand that Clara never had an example. She was never thought about how a marriage, what was a happy marriage. But that wasn't the point. There was harmony, there was happiness, okay. But then her behavior started to change slightly at first. Some changes here, some changes there. And then it has started to be clear for her family that there was something wrong. And then she was in the hospital, she was under some examinations, and after a while, the doctors didn't see any problem. She was discharged, but her mood swings, they continued. She returned to the hospital, and then she had her diagnosis, schizophrenia. And her grandmother and mother and aunts had the same disease. And she was in the hospital, she underwent some treatments, and during some of those treatments, when Clara talked, she talked about some stuff that made the doctors realize that she could have been raped by her own father, that her mother during her crisis, she tried to kill Clara with a butcher knife, and she had lots of terrible experiences before she becoming an actress, in her teens and in her childhood, that she suppressed. And she started saying that to the psychiatrists. And I don't say that as a gossip and, oh, her father did that to her. Oh, no. The lesson of all that is that Clara Bow was a woman who had a terrible life, but she had a very, very successful career due to her own merits against all odds, that she overcame terrible things that many people wouldn't be able to overcome, that despite all those horrible things that happened to her, she kept her good heart, that she remained a good person, that she was full of charisma, full of good stuff in her heart despite that. So, if the story of her life teaches a lesson, it has to be a lesson of resilience, of not being afraid of problems, of resisting. Anyway, she started to have these problems and she tested for schizophrenia. She tested positive. And then after a while, it became clear that she enjoyed a lot to live in reclusion, that she only felt happy if she lived alone with her independence. And after a while, she lived by herself with her nurse nearby, but she lived apart from her family, but being visited by her husband, her children, and it turned out to be a good thing for her. So in the last decades of her life, she lived alone, with the companion of her nurse, being visited by her family, but the stress of living at home, raising kids, and taking care of her husband, of her house, was too much for her, because Clara had already passed through lots of stress in life. With her difficult life, when she was so poor and humiliated and abused, during her Hollywood stardom, with all of her work and scandals and all pressures in the press, and then her wedding and her marriage, it was all those things combined. They were too much for her. And by living alone, she could have independence and she could live well and she could relax for the first time in her life. It seems to be a very sad thing because, come on, she could have lived with her husband and children, but I don't see that this way. She had the life she wanted to have. She had the company of her family sometimes. Nobody stole her money. When she left her career in Hollywood, she was a rich woman, and she remained a rich woman for the rest of her life. For example, her husband and her relatives, of course, she was very much taken advantage during her stardom days. But her husband and her sons, they were good people. So she still had her money, her independence, her comfort, and she did what she wanted to do. And she was happy in her own way. And she had her family around. Not all the time, not under the same roof, but she did. When her sons got married, she met her daughters-in-law. She loved her sons. She loved her daughters-in-law, her grandchildren. Of course, she was separated from her husband, but they were on good terms. It was a much better life for her compared with her mother, grandmother, and aunts who died in mental hospitals, all alone in the middle of poverty and despair. Clara was saved from that, and she could have very beautiful final years to live in comfort, to live a decent and fulfilling life. And that's how she spent many of her years. She liked to read the news at home. She liked to study. She knew everything that happened in the outside world. She had an opinion for everything. And she did the things she liked to do, her hobbies and everything. And she passed away very young, at only 60 years old, in 1965. She had a heart attack and passed away. It was a peaceful passing, fortunately, because she didn't deserve to suffer or anything. And that's how she lived. A very talented actress who was so maltreated by life at first, who didn't always have the self-esteem to acknowledge her talent, but many people did acknowledge her talent. For example, if you are a silent film fan, you probably know an actress called Louise Brooks. She was an American actress, and she was famous for a film called Pandora's Box, which was filmed in Germany in 1929. Louise Brooks had met Clara Bow in real life, and she loved Clara. Clara was her idol, and she spoke highly of Clara Bow until the end of her life, how Clara Bow was talented, how Clara Bow was a good person. And when Louise Brooks met Clara Bow was a Hollywood star. Louise Brooks wasn't famous yet, and how Clara Bow treated her so well, how she complimented her beauty, and she was nobody. Nobody knew her. She was only another actress. And how Clara didn't behave like a star or everything, and how they talked as friends. And that says volumes about Clara Bow's personality. So I finished this episode saying that even if you are not a fan of cinema, even if you are not a fan of silent films, seriously, Clara Bow's life story is truly inspirational. It teaches a lot about resilience. It teaches a lot that it's always worth it to be a good person. It's always worth it to do the right thing. And that no matter how much you are maltreated by life, you will be rewarded and you will feel fulfilled. And that's it.